Looks like somebody could use a little help. Chemicals are a part of virtually every workplace. We need them in our manufacturing, construction, and industrial processes. And they're part of our office environments too. But while offering tremendous benefits, chemicals can also be hazardous to our health. For the next few minutes, we're going to discuss your right to know important information about any potentially hazardous chemicals where you work and where to find it. And we'll have a little help along the way to demonstrate how unintended exposure can occur. After viewing this first section, you should be able to identify the 3 main ways to learn about the chemicals in your workplace. Chemicals in the workplace are used to help you do your job, but they can be harmful if you don't understand their properties. That's why hazard communication, or HAZCOM, is important. Your company wants you to know how to handle potentially hazardous chemicals safely.
We're going to be cleaning the 577 tank today.
There are 3 ways for you to find out what you need to know about any chemical you handle on the job. They are material safety data sheets, commonly known by the initials MSDS.
Be sure and use a full face respirator.
The second is container labeling. And finally, the third, your company's hazard communication plan. Okay, number 1, material safety data sheets. The material safety data sheet, or MSDS, is basically a guide for the safe use of a specific chemical and is the primary source for information about that product. While these sheets may look like pretty boring reading, they could save your life. Copies of MSDSs for all chemicals on site should be available so you can review them before working with a specific product. If you don't know where to find material safety data sheets at your job site, ask your supervisor. Although MSDSs from various manufacturers may look slightly different, they all carry the same basic information, including the name or names the chemical is recognized by, the manufacturer, any hazardous ingredients, the chemical hazards, first aid procedures, spill cleanup methods, handling and storage, and finally, personal protective equipment you should wear when working with the chemical. They contain all the important information you need to know when working with a particular chemical, all in one easy-to-find place. Number 2, read the container. Container labels also provide information. Most labels have the name of the chemical, health, fire, and reactivity hazards, precautions, and situations to avoid. If necessary, the label will list what personal protective equipment, or PPE, to wear to work safely with the chemical. As with MSDS sheets, each label manufacturer may present information in a different manner. Some warnings are written. Other labels use symbols, colors, numbers, or letters to indicate potential hazards. Becoming familiar with the different types of labeling is important. Knowing the details of the chemicals you work with is part of your job too. Number 3, your company's hazard communication program. Your company's written hazard communication plan lists the hazardous chemicals at your workplace. If you cannot find adequate information from either the MSDS or labels, this is one more resource. And the hazard communication plan might provide more specific information on how a particular chemical is used at your workplace. Remember, you have the right to know about every chemical you might come in contact with while on the job. Even run-of-the-mill chemicals purchased from the local hardware store, like paint thinner or pesticides. These should also have an MSDS for that chemical on site. This is because an MSDS will have additional information on it not usually found on the product's container or label. Chemical manufacturers and distributors issue a material safety data sheet for each product they provide. The Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, is your guide to the safe use of a specific chemical. After viewing this section, you should be able to locate specific safe usage information for a chemical using a material safety data sheet. Although material safety data sheets may differ in the order of information, each MSDS lists the following data: the chemical identity of the hazardous chemicals involved, the common names of the chemical, the identification of the organization responsible for preparing the sheet, known acute and chronic health effects, as well as related health information, exposure limits, or the amount of exposure considered safe to the user, whether the chemical is a carcinogen or suspected carcinogen, precautionary measures and personal protective equipment necessary, emergency and first aid procedures, spill cleanup techniques, and proper storage and handling. Become familiar with the MSDS information on any chemical you'll be working with before you handle it. Remember, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In the United States, companies are required to provide employees with a comprehensive written hazard communication plan. Now, what is contained in that plan, and why should you care about it? Good question. Your answer is coming up. In this section, we will identify the key elements of a hazard communication plan. All employers in the United States must develop and maintain a written hazard communication program that should include the following: information on how to interpret symbols and warnings found on container labeling, such as the diamond hazard system for health, flammability, corrosiveness, and reactivity. Material safety data sheets. Copies are kept with the plan, and the plan can be an alternative source for MSDS in case the sheets are missing or illegible at other locations. The employee training program with a description of the requirements you must meet, a list of the hazardous chemicals found in your workplace, which can be used for quick reference, a description of the way your employer will inform employees of safety measures for non-routine tasks, such as cleaning out a storage tank, or evacuation and emergency plans and procedures, as well as the hazards associated with chemicals in unlabeled systems and piping. All of these elements are there for your protection and safety. Remember, the plan is there to protect you, so read it, use it, and live it. After watching this section, you should be able to define terms used to describe exposure to hazardous chemicals. Communicating during and after an exposure event is critical to maintaining everyone's safety. In addition, understanding certain terms will help keep you and those around you safe when dealing with hazardous chemicals. In the real world, it's no joke. The following words and phrases will help you better understand exposure and the potential effects of hazardous chemicals. Okay, let's go through them now. Duration of exposure, the length of time between the beginning and end of a single exposure to a hazardous chemical. The longer you are exposed to a chemical, the more likely you are to be affected by it. Short-term exposure. This is a brief exposure without repetition. Like our friend here, it's an accidental, generally contained spill that is cleaned up within minutes. Long-term exposure. This involves repeated exposures to a hazardous chemical. Chemical exposure over a long period of time can be particularly hazardous because some chemicals can accumulate in the body or because the damage does not have a chance to be repaired by the body. Long-term exposure may cause disease or have other health effects. Acute effects. These are usually brought about by a short-term exposure. Acute effects occur immediately or soon after exposure, often to a large dose or significant contact over a short period. The effects can be minor or severe and are often reversible after exposure stops. Burns or blindness are examples of possible acute effects. Dose. This is the amount of chemical entering or absorbed by the body. The larger the dose, the more acute any symptoms may be. Routes of entry. These are the ways hazardous chemicals can enter the body, including skin or eye contact, inhalation, or ingestion. Let's take a minute and examine each route of entry. Skin or eye contact. Exposure can occur when solids, liquids, or gases touch unprotected skin or the eyes. Chemical exposure in liquid form usually causes more acute symptoms. Inhalation. This occurs when you breathe in a hazardous substance in the form of dust, fumes, or mist. Ingestion occurs when you swallow any hazardous material, either through eating something that somehow got part of the material on it, or through accidental transfer. Now let's talk about exposure limits. Threshold limit value, TLV, or permissible exposure limit, PEL, is the amount of a chemical you can be exposed to safely day after day with no harmful effects. These levels are listed in the chemical's MSDS. Toxic substances. Toxicity is the potential of a chemical to cause harm. Highly toxic chemicals can cause harm at low exposure levels. Non-toxic chemicals do not cause harm, even at high exposures. Examples of toxic substances are solvents, pesticides, and polymers. Corrosives can cause damage to human tissue at the point of contact. Most acids are corrosives. Many bases, such as caustic soda, are also corrosives. Irritants are often diluted forms of corrosive substances such as ammonia, antifreeze, thinners, and degreasers. Damage caused by irritants is typically reversible and usually minor compared with corrosives. Flammables and combustibles. Flammable chemicals have a flash point at or less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Combustible chemicals have a flash point between 100 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Flash point is the lowest temperature at which vapors emitted from a chemical will ignite. Gasoline is flammable, for example, and releases vapors that will ignite as low as -45 degrees Fahrenheit. Motor oil is combustible, so its vapors will not ignite until the temperature is between 100 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Radiation. Sources include infrared, ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma rays. Exposure to certain types and levels of radiation can cause serious damage to cells and tissues, much like carcinogens. Finally, remember the dose, the duration, and the route of entry will be the major determining factors as to whether an exposure will be harmful. That's hot stuff, and not something you would want to come into direct contact with. After watching this section, you should be able to define corrosives and irritants and identify the effects of exposure to both. Corrosives are substances that can cause immediate, serious, and possibly permanent skin damage on contact. Corrosives are often identified as acids or bases, depending on a chemical attribute called pH. Many acids are corrosive substances. Corrosives such as sulfuric acid can be found in automobile batteries, dyes, paints, and many industrial processes. Many bases are also corrosive. Caustic soda is a corrosive base, sometimes found in soaps, detergents, and water treatment processes. Skin contact with corrosives can cause redness, swelling, and severe burns. Eye exposure to corrosives could result in permanent blindness. Inhalation of corrosives can cause damage to your nose, mouth, and lungs. Ingestion or swallowing of corrosives, though extremely rare, can result in severe internal injuries and death. Irritants are substances that can cause an inflammatory response or reaction from the eyes, skin, or respiratory system. Irritants are often diluted forms of corrosives, such as ammonia, antifreeze, thinners, degreasers, and acids. Other irritants can be byproducts generated during combustion. Corrosives usually cause tissue damage by direct contact, resulting in mild to severe burns. The damage can be permanent. Both acids and bases can cause severe burns. Equal precaution should be taken when handling either type. Irritants generally cause much less damage than corrosives. The redness or swelling caused by irritants is usually reversible and temporary. But on the job, take them both seriously and use adequate protection. After completing this episode, you should be able to define flash point and identify the difference between flammables and combustibles. The key to determining if a chemical is flammable or combustible is its flash point. Flash point is the temperature at which a substance releases vapors that can ignite. In a fire, liquids and solids don't burn the way most people think. During a fire, the vapors coming off the superheated materials fuel the combustion. Solids or liquids are further vaporized by the heat until no more flammable vapor is discharged and fuel is spent. If a substance is heated to vaporization, yet does not emit vapors that will ignite, then that substance is said to be non-combustible. The difference between combustible and flammable substances is the flash point. Labeling standards in the United States require a warning in 3 places for all flammable or combustible materials: on the container label, the MSDS, and your company's written hazard communication plan. Treat flammable and combustible chemicals with extreme caution. Avoid using such chemicals around potential ignition sources. And remember, the warmer the ambient temperature, the greater the possibility a substance has reached its flash point. A good safe work practice is to assume a chemical is always at or above its flash point and act accordingly. Remember, if you use a flammable or combustible chemical, always assume that chemical is at or above its flash point. Next, we will define carcinogen, identify how to determine if a substance is or may be a carcinogen, and list precautions to take when handling such substances. Carcinogens are substances known to cause cancer. Carcinogens disrupt normal cell processes, so the cells grow abnormally. Such altered cells are said to be mutated. These abnormal cells can upset normal body function and lead to cancer.
How long ago that happened?
Carcinogens most frequently affect the lungs, liver, kidneys, and the reproductive system. Cancer typically develops over a long period, so there is no quick indicator you are being exposed to damaging or lethal levels. To protect yourself, you need to know which chemicals are carcinogens and which ones are suspected to be carcinogenic. You can determine if a material is carcinogenic by reading the material safety data sheet for that substance. The MSDS will also provide you with proper handling instructions and protective equipment needed. The container label should also provide information as to the carcinogenic status of a substance. Suspected carcinogens may be just as damaging or lethal as confirmed carcinogens, but the link to cancer is not yet proven. Since repeated exposure to carcinogens increases your chances of developing cancer, knowing the permissible exposure level, or PEL, for a given substance is vital. Remember, the PEL is the amount of a substance to which you may be exposed safely day after day with no ill effects. If the PEL is not on the MSDS, you may have to obtain the information from the manufacturer. Proper PPE usage when handling carcinogens or suspected carcinogens is also critical, since exposure can occur through ingestion, inhalation, and skin contact. Read all warnings and follow instructions every time you use a carcinogen or suspected carcinogen, because the effect of carcinogens is cumulative. In other words, every time you are improperly exposed, your chances of contracting cancer increase. And remember, the best way to protect yourself from carcinogens or suspected carcinogens is to wear proper personal protective equipment. Follow all written instructions for handling a substance, and do not allow yourself to be exposed to a substance above the PEL. Okay, let's continue. In this section, we will define radiation, radioactivity, and the term norm. In addition, we will identify how radiation affects the human body. Radiation is energy traveling in the form of particles or electromagnetic waves. Common examples are microwaves used for heating food, radio waves, sunlight, and X-rays. Radioactivity is a natural, spontaneous process by which unstable atoms of an element give off or radiate excess energy in the form of particles or waves. Radioactive material is any substance that contains these radiating atoms. Ionization is a particular high-energy characteristic of the radiation produced when radioactive elements decay. When ionizing radiation interacts with materials, the radiation can remove electrons from the atoms in the substance. This effect is the reason ionizing radiation is hazardous to health. However, the likelihood is very slight of you being exposed to levels of radiation on the job that will affect your health. Everything in our world contains small amounts of radioactive atoms, and the Earth is constantly receiving cosmic radiation from outer space. Natural sources of radiation account for more than 80% of the average annual radiation dose per person. These natural sources are referred to as background radiation. Radiation causes cell damage. At low doses, like what we receive every day from background radiation, the cells repair the damage rapidly. It's good to be aware of the power of high doses of radiation, but remember, the odds are extremely remote of you being exposed to unhealthy levels of radiation on the job. Man-made radiation is heavily regulated and carefully controlled. Very few people have ever received a strong enough dose to experience radiation sickness, and fewer still have died from exposure to workplace radiation. If you have questions about potential radiation at your workplace, talk to your supervisor. Finally, there is a type of radiation known as norm. Norm stands for naturally occurring radioactive material. and can be found in underground water or natural gas, for example. Norm levels are typically quite low and are not a health hazard unless the norm becomes concentrated. If norm exists at your work site, you should receive specific training on the detection, handling, and operation of equipment in such locations. Before you start a job, always check to see if you need any special PPE. In this section, we will identify 3 ways to determine what special personal protective equipment may be required when working with hazardous chemicals. The basic personal protective equipment in many industries consists of a hard hat, safety glasses with side shields, and in many places, steel-toed shoes. There are often tasks, however, requiring a greater degree of protection. When using hazardous chemicals, for example.
Want to be sure and use a full-face respirator.
There are 3 places to find out what PPE is required before you handle a particular chemical. You can read the MSDS for that chemical, the chemical's container label, or check your company's written hazard communication program. Finding this information is your responsibility if you are the person who will be using the chemical. With most hazardous chemicals, you will be required to use proper eye protection. Goggles only protect the eyes, so a full-face shield is often called for to prevent splashes and flashes from hitting your face. Special boots and gloves may also be required. Make sure the boots and gloves you select provide an adequate barrier to the chemical. Understanding the protective equipment is just as important as understanding the chemical hazard. If you're not sure of the best PPE to wear for a given situation, contact your supervisor. Many hazardous chemicals require chemical-resistant coveralls or a chemical apron. Coveralls are made in different levels of chemical resistance. Be sure the coveralls you select have the proper resistance to the chemical you will be exposed to. And remember, all PPE must fit properly to be effective. Certain chemicals will also require respiratory protection, since hazardous fumes or mists may be a byproduct of that chemical's use. You should be trained in the proper way to perform a fit test for any full or half-face mask, as well as how to select the proper organic filters for a given respirator. With some chemicals, a self-contained breathing apparatus may even be necessary. Again, you should be trained in the proper use of such equipment. These are general guidelines about what to expect. However, these guidelines are no substitute for a careful review of the MSDS for each chemical before you start a job. And remember, what you don't know can hurt you. Find out about your PPE before you start work. Okay, in this section we will identify proper conditions for storing hazardous chemicals, as well as what to do if you are exposed to such chemicals. Storing hazardous chemicals under proper conditions is important in maintaining a safe workplace. Fumes are always a potential hazard escaping from decaying or open containers. Chemical storage areas therefore need adequate ventilation. Good lighting is also a necessity for reading container labels. A storage location identification system is necessary so users will understand how to remove and replace chemicals correctly. Strong, stable shelving, well spaced for ease of access, reduces the risk of accidents. All chemicals not stored in original containers must be marked with the chemical name and hazard data. Never mix chemicals unless it is part of a defined and approved work-related task. All flammables must be stored in UL-approved containers and approved cabinets. Gas canisters, cylinders, or bottles are especially dangerous if not stored correctly. They must be stored upright with safety caps screwed on and a chain or bracket holding them securely in place so they will not tip or fall over. Cylinders not stored in this fashion have been known to go through brick walls after falling. If you're exposed to a hazardous chemical, you need to know what to do quickly to minimize the effect on yourself or others. The number one thing to be aware of in most incidents is the location of the nearest running water. Find water sources before starting the job. Immediate treatment for most exposures require that water be run over the exposed area for at least 15 minutes. However, be sure to read the MSDS for a chemical before starting work to be sure that flushing with water is the proper first reaction. Some exposures are large enough that a shower is necessary. Always determine the location of the nearest shower when working with a hazardous chemical. Remove contaminated clothing and keep exposed areas under running water for a minimum of 15 minutes. Chemicals splashed into the eyes can cause quick and severe damage. Always know your quickest route to an eye wash station. Discuss the location of showers and eye wash stations in your pre-job and safety meetings. Hold your eyelids open and flush with clean running water for at least 15 minutes. If you or someone you are helping has inhaled a chemical, get away from the chemical source and into fresh air immediately. Check the container or MSDS to find if the exposed person will need medical care. Although swallowing a hazardous chemical is rare, if it occurs, consult the MSDS for that chemical immediately. Different chemicals require different immediate treatment. Inducing vomiting could actually cause harm in some cases. Seek medical attention after any hazardous exposure, no matter how small. Some chemicals may have a delayed or long-term effect. If medical treatment is administered, be sure to give a copy of the MSDS to medical personnel. Remember, knowing how to contact medical services or the location of the MSDS is important in the event of chemical exposure. But because of the frequency of splash incidents, the most important thing to know is the closest source of running water. An MSDS for the chemical involved in an accidental exposure can be very valuable for the following reasons. It can tell you if the victim will need medical attention after an exposure. It can also tell you if a victim needs to have vomiting induced. An MSDS can also tell medical personnel important facts about the chemical the victim has been exposed to. And most importantly, after an accident occurs is not the time to start looking for water sources or showers or first aid. Take time before the job starts to get prepared. After completing this section, you should be able to describe how to respond to a hazardous chemical spill. If you observe a spill and are untrained in rescue and containment techniques, you are defined as a first responder. A first responder's sole duty is to respond to the situation quickly by notifying proper company contacts at your worksite. Find out who to contact in a spill emergency before you need to know. The more information you can give, the better, without exposing yourself to the spill. The chemical type, size of the spill, and so on is valuable information for trained responders. Knowledge of the chemical and your own limitations is key to your taking a role in a small spill. If you know you are already wearing the proper PPE and are familiar with routes of absorption and the chemical's properties, you should use your own best judgment about stopping a small spill. However, some situations will be serious enough to require you to wait for backup, to increase your protective equipment, or to get trained professionals involved. Containing and cleaning up a spill of a hazardous chemical must be done according to the guidelines described in the chemical's MSDS. This procedure will also require PPE adequate for the length and magnitude of exposure. Again, there is no substitute for training here. If you haven't been trained on what to do quickly, even a small spill can be a problem. The disposal of all hazardous chemicals must be done according to federal guidelines. Proper disposal guidelines appear in the MSDS for the chemical. Some disposal jobs require that you let the professionals do the job. As a first responder, your first and only responsibility in the event of a hazardous chemical spill is to report the spill, no matter how small, to the proper personnel at your worksite. In a spill situation, the best tool to protect the health and lives of you and your co-workers is your good judgment. You'll need to judge the severity of the spill and the adequacy of your PPE before you consider rescue or containment of the spill. And if the spill is severe, call for trained help immediately. Okay, that brings us to the end of this program. HAZCOM, your right to know. Your company has provided the information, the MSDS sheets, a hazard communication plan, and an emergency response plan. Now it's up to you. You are the only one who can practice the key points provided in this program. We all take pride in knowing how to do our work tasks well. But as a part of your daily job tasks, you're also expected to know and understand the critical information on potential hazards associated with the chemicals used at your work site. It's just part of the job. And remember, it's also your right to know.